Recording and engineering vocals in your home studio? Performing your own vocals as well? In this video, I'm offering up some tips to the musician who takes on one or both of these efforts alone, either by preference or necessity. And since today's video marks the 6th installment in the 2nd season of my creative series, we'll be using my song Bad Stuff as an example when needed. If you're unfamiliar with the creative series, it's where I break down the different processes that go into creating new original music. Focusing on one production at a time, these are available as playlists on this channel. Thanks very much, and let's jump in. Do you ever struggle with keeping your voice in tune while recording in the studio? Well, through years of anecdotal evidence working as a producer and an engineer, I've found that in many cases when a singer is having a hard time staying in tune, it's not necessarily because they're no good, haven't warmed up properly, have a bad headphone mix, or even because they have anxiety about nailing a great studio take. Don't get me wrong, all of those can be issues, but I've noticed that what could be causing the problem is that they're having a hard time staying glued to a tonal center to sing around. Navigating your voice through a wall of distorted guitars, a sparse arrangement that relies heavily on drums or percussion, recording your voice separate from the instrument that you wrote the song on or normally perform it with can feel unnatural and throw you off that tonal center. So, a little guide might be all you need in order to help you along and keep your vocal tuning in check. This shows up in the form of a pedal point. A pedal point is a note that is sustained through a section of music or even throughout the duration of a song. Usually, it's the note represented by the key you're in, so if your song is in C major, then the pedal would be a C. A pedal could take place on a different note, like the 5th, but then that wouldn't be the tonal center, and that's what we want to focus on here. This note is intended to be temporarily used during tracking and then removed from the project later on. All right, so here we are in Logic Pro, and we have our example song Bad Stuff, which I have stemmed down into 9 audio tracks. Just in case you're brand new, stemming down means, for example, this stereo drum file used to be about 12 different drum tracks that I just mixed down into a stereo file. And then here on this software instrument track, I'm going to pull up the sampler, and here I have loaded the samples that I usually use to help people with, who might be drifting around pitch-wise, and that is a nice neutral-sounding legato string section. So this song is in G major, and what I did, I just tripled up on the note G. So we got 1 octave, 2nd octave, and 3rd octave. And like I said, if somebody is having a hard time staying in pitch, then I'll introduce this idea to them. So first I'll play it back without the string as a pedal.
Stars are gone, they're giving up, and cashed and bent the knee.
Now I'll put it in.
The deep blues and grays of the night fade to pale blue and technicolored green.
So yeah, it just adds a bed of the root note, and sometimes I'll even mute the other instruments and just have that playing back.
Through the wrinkled arms of the tree.
I'll leave the drums in so that they have a sense of time. Especially since as a songwriter, you're not necessarily the greatest vocalist ever. You just wrote the lyrics, you wrote a story, and you want to tell it. And when you start getting too pitchy, that story becomes muddled, and then you have to resort to the use of auto-tune or Melodyne, and sometimes that can end up sounding too plasticky or robotic. You know, when you're not looking for that kind of thing, it's not good. So then you can pretty much just leave that in for the duration of your song, as long as the song doesn't modulate, meaning change keys. Then you would just adjust the root note to wherever it modulates to. Like for instance, in the pre-chorus here, I go down to the relative minor, which would be E minor. But since that's not really a modulation, you can just let the G drone or pedal run through.
In a valley of shade, the dark hides for the rest of the day. I don't wanna sing about anything bad. I heard enough about that. Give me soul. I don't wanna add to the weight of the world. Yeah.
So then you just let it run until the end of the song and, of course, mute it when you're done. It's a simple little trick, but it really has saved quite a few performances of people that I've worked with in the studio who either aren't accustomed to singing away from the instrument they wrote the song on, or are having a hard time finding that tonal center due to the other instruments in the arrangement. Or it could be another reason that I'm not really aware of, but it definitely has worked in the past. Okay, next tip. Don't waste your money on an overpriced isolation shield. Whatever that means, because these things definitely do little to nothing to isolate you. What they do accomplish is a reduction in room reflections coming at the microphone from the sides and the rear, but these reflections are much less important than what the shields do nothing to reduce, which are the room reflections being directed at the front of the capsule. It can be argued that these shields do absorb some of the sound before it gets scattered into the room, thus reducing reflections to begin with. However, in my experience, only the highest of the high-end models can achieve this with their more complex designs, meaning the ones that cost between $100 to $300 or even more. And even they provide little to no attention to the lower end of the frequency spectrum. So why worry about room reflections at all? Well, for a lot of recording scenarios in a home studio, you'll want to minimize these reflections because we're not recording in acoustically treated rooms that we can benefit from. Recording a drier signal with minimized reflections allows us to find the right ambiance or reverb later on when mixing. Not all, but a lot of singing scenarios call for a condenser microphone in a cardioid polar pattern. A cardioid pattern means that the majority of the sound is captured from the center front of the mic. So that means if it were an ideal world, then these reflection-reducing contraptions would actually be up to 8 times larger and would be placed behind you, aimed at the mic. However, that would make them ridiculously more expensive and cumbersome to set up, which would mean less sales and a smaller profit margin, so somehow an entire cottage industry of these things has popped up, promising better recordings, but again, ignore the area most important to consider. A much cheaper solution is to get a clothing rack off Amazon or Walmart for around $25 and throw your comforter or blanket over that. Then place it behind you while recording your voice or anything else you'd like. Then, if you want, you could get some studio foam squares, which usually run around $25 per 12-pack, and then tape 2 of them to a mic stand to reduce the higher frequency reflections. Want to take your reflection absorption one step further? Then you can take a few of those foam squares, cut them up to suit your aesthetic, and spray glue them to the ceiling over wherever you decide to place your microphone. Now you've got a much better vocal recording solution than the poorly named shields offer, with some extra studio foam, and all for less money. Okay, for the final tip, which could be considered more of a piece of advice, I'll end on this. Don't chase your role models. What do I mean by this? Well, of course, don't try to hit ridiculous pitches that are out of your range just because one of your heroes is or was able to do that. But also, it's important to be aware of whether or not you're sounding like yourself or if you're attempting to sound like or mimic another singer's behavior. This behavior is known as vocal timbre. Words like dark, bright, brassy, bold, and jarring come to mind to describe somebody's vocal timbre. Also, inflections, pronunciations, and articulations encompass how people detect your unique vocal timbre. It's important that you sound like you, and although you might naturally sound like an established singer, no two singers are completely identical.
Allegedly!
While you may get by for a little while as another sound-alike or novelty act, an audience ultimately does appreciate authenticity, and this authenticity will in turn result in your overall longevity. One example of perhaps mass inauthentic singing or mass mimicking was in the 90s when there was a thing called Eddie Vedder voice. It seemed like almost everyone on the radio was doing an impression of Pearl Jam's Eddie Vedder. And while of course he sounded natural singing like himself, almost everybody else sounded like they were singing from the upper part of their throat and underneath their tongue. Yeah! The only thing worse than this was Kurt Cobain voice, which was even harder to imitate, and unfortunately has apparently made a resurgence if TikTok has anything to say about it. So these copycat acts were not only short-lived, but are also perhaps why the alternative music movement in general seemed to die off a little bit too early without reaching its ultimate potential. So not only did this mass mimicking do little to serve the people engaging in it, it also damaged and cheapened real artistic progress. Anyways, it's difficult to criticize yourself of something like this if you're unaware of it, because it could be taking place subconsciously. So what you can do is you can find somebody who you know that's honest and ask them for their insight. But if you don't have any friends or you don't trust anybody, try this. Record a few takes of a track that you're working on, and then let it sit for a few days, or even a week or so, and then come back to it with fresh ears. Taking time away will allow you to be more objective and to pick up on anything that might sound contrived, forced, too labored over, or just oddly unnatural, like you're trying to be something or someone that you're not. And with some practice, it will become obvious to you on what you'd like to do differently. This kind of self-criticism can be a little disheartening if you allow it to be. We are, after all, our own worst critics. But if you look at it like a learning experience, then it will undoubtedly make you a better singer. Alright, so if any of these vocal tips have helped you with your music creation, or if this video has at least entertained you in some way, then you know what to do if you want to stay tuned for more stuff. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.